have to be a genius to know that the SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic is wreaking havoc on the economy worldwide. However, if there's one sector that is really taking a hit, it is the tourism sector. Suddenly, this activity, which was fundamental, essential, key in the economy of many countries, as for example Spain, has practically stopped in its tracks, taking millions and millions of jobs with it. Many hotels, restaurants, bars, cafes, and a long list of businesses of all kinds have been forced to pull down their blinds and close their doors. And friends, keep in mind that the impact is not only touching small businesses, there are also large groups that are also suffering. We only have to look at the giants of the air transport sector, giants that are very much affected by the drying up of tourism, but also by the collapse of business travel. And yes, whilst it's true that the air transport sector accounts for barely 0.3% of the value added to services in the OECD countries, it is, nevertheless, a fundamental activity that supports millions of people and thousands of companies whose activity depends on people being able to move around the world easily. And of course, it can be a good gauge for measuring the trend of international economic activity. But in the end, it's pretty clear. If the restrictions imposed to deal with the pandemic don't allow you to travel, or if they turn the experience of traveling into a nightmare of restrictions and impediments, who on earth is going to fill the planes that were once full of tourists, professionals, and people looking to do business? So, how is this sector really doing? What exactly has been the impact of the coronavirus? Friends, as you can imagine, as the months go by and the situation of the crisis and restrictions continues to be extended, the aviation sector is having an increasingly worse time.
Coronavirus. Airline set for worst year on record. BBC.
In this video, we're going to give you some important details about how various companies are dealing with this situation. And we will not only take a look at the airlines, but also at the major aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. Manufacturers who obviously depend on the airline companies doing well. After all, remember that without passengers, there are no flights. Without flights, there are no planes. And without the need for planes, there will be no new planes sold. Then again, does this reasoning hold up? Let's take a look.
The crisis in figures.
Pay attention to these figures, because what we are going to tell you is the true picture of what is probably already the biggest crisis we have seen, and something that we may never see again in the air transport sector. A crisis that makes the one that occurred in the wake of the 9/11 attacks look like a walk in the park. Take, for example, this graph that reflects the number of flights tracked by the Flight Radar 24 website in 2019 and 2020. As you can see, between March and April 2020, the number of air operations slumped to around a quarter of those registered in 2019, and during the rest of 2020, barely half of that loss has been recovered. All of this obviously translates into multi-million-dollar losses, firstly for the airlines and also potentially for the aircraft manufacturers. And of course, for all those sectors that depend directly on this activity, from the aeronautical catering companies to the ubiquitous duty-free stores. But let's just focus on the airlines for now. You see, a recent market analysis by the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, has tried to calculate the impact of the pandemic. Total industry revenues are expected to fall by 46% in 2020 compared to those of 2019. Airlines face the loss of $314 billion in ticket sales revenue, putting half of the world's airlines at serious risk of bankruptcy. Airlines have reduced their seat supply by an average of 70% since January 2020 and have burned through more than $10 billion a month in uncovered costs, such as aircraft leasing, maintenance, payroll, fees, and a host of other fixed costs that, whether the planes fly or not, have to be dealt with. And by 2021, the situation is not expected to be particularly buoyant either. The forecast is for airlines to burn through a total between $5 billion and $6 billion a month in cash. And that helps to explain what we see in this graph. As you can see, there's a huge gulf that only promises to become even greater, considering that 2020 is not yet finished. Traditionally, the second half is the most profitable for airlines, but that is unlikely to be the case in the midst of new restrictions. But friends, the impact is not only to be felt in the loss of trips. The huge drop in demand for flights is compounded by the extra costs that the pandemic travel brings, and which may remain a heavy burden for a long time. For example, airlines now have to invest much more in cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting planes, which also means spending spending more time on the ground and less in the air. Passengers also have to spend more time on the ground because of increased controls at airports, which means that air connections between flights are no longer as short as they once were. Without a doubt, this poses a challenge for flight scheduling. And you know how it goes, any plane on the ground costs money. But that's not all. Flight crews now also have to be provided with self-filtering masks and in many cases goggles and even complete PPE, almost like healthcare workers, equipment that is currently in use on many Asian airlines such as AirAsia, Korean Air, and most Chinese companies. Friends, all of these factors are just some of the many that have led companies around the world to end up on the brink of bankruptcy, or even to declare bankruptcy already. Unfortunately, the damage that the coronavirus is doing to the aviation industry could be, in many ways, irreparable for a certain period of time, perhaps several years. Years during which the trend for low-cost flights, or at least low cost in the sense we've known them, could be greatly affected. Now, will it get to that point? What effects is this crisis having on the airlines? What role are the governments playing in all this? Well, let's take a look.
Airlines on the brink.
With nearly 2/3 of the world's 26,000 passenger aircraft grounded and some 25 million jobs at risk, airlines have faced a major dilemma this 2020. Find ways to avoid closure, even if it means resorting to bankruptcy or public bailout mechanisms. Mechanisms that work better or worse, depending on the country and the particular region we are talking about. For example, if we look at the evolution of airlines in the first months of 2020 and what their financial risk is, we see a pattern that benefits East Asia but is particularly damaging for Africa and Latin America. In Latin America, many airlines have already begun filing for bankruptcy, such as Avianca's operations in the United States, Aeromexico, LATAM, and TAME, while in Africa, airlines such as South African Airways, which already had problems before the coronavirus, Air Mauritius, and Comair are in a similar situation. And although bankruptcy does not necessarily imply the disappearance of the company, the truth is that the issue is usually resolved in two ways, either with the liquidation of the assets and the end of the brand, or with the financial restructuring of the debt, the delivery of a state aid package, and, if necessary, the replacement or dilution of the former shareholders. And it is possible that it is precisely this situation that will generate differences between some regions of the world in the near future, because it's clear that this drain from economic losses leaves few airlines that will be able to weather the storm on their own, without state aid in the form of subsidies, investments, or loans. Or at least that's what the politicians say, you know. Although it is true that the risk of messy bankruptcy proceedings could be great,
Many governments have done a good job in financially supporting aviation jobs. Where this has not happened, in Latin America, for example, we see bankruptcies. Airlines continue to burn through cash, and that is expected to persist into next year. Without a second tranche of financial aid, many airlines will not make it through the winter. Alexandre de Uniac, Director General of the International Air Transport Association.
Not only does this risk that, once again, we taxpayers will end up paying the price for our politicians' decisions, but it also risks falling back into the catastrophic renationalization policies of many airlines. Of course, apart from that potential risk, airlines, as you can imagine, support public rescues at all costs. According to them, in this case, it is not that a company is performing badly and is going bankrupt, but that the health measures imposed by governments, such as confinements, quarantines, curfews, hotel closures, and other measures taken to combat the pandemic, directly attack the business of the airlines, which, above all, depends on transporting tourists and business people. In other words, it is not that one or another company is sinking due to bad management, but rather that this very special situation that few companies in the sector, however much cash and savings they have, will be able to bear on their own. For the airlines, it has meant putting a hold on their source of income, while expenses continue to run high. But let's say that to be more or less in support of public bailouts depend on each airline, and I suppose also on how that support materializes. Non-refundable aid is not the same as loans with preferential conditions. The fact is that in the first 6 months of 2020 alone, the world's airlines have received $162 billion in state aid, a huge amount of money of which they have already consumed around 80%. And of course, if we consider that air traffic is not expected to return to 2019 levels until at least 2024, more money will be needed. Much more money. But the question is, what else is being done besides transferring public money? Well, check this out.
Cathay Pacific acts as regional carrier and 8,500 jobs. BBC. Korean Air to buy Asiana emerges as world's 10th largest airline. Yonhap News Agency. China's top airline returns to profit as domestic routes bloom. Nikkei Asia.
If you stop to think about it for a moment, these three news stories may represent the living image of what the aviation market is going to be like over the next few years. It's a market that faces several challenges. Cuts in flight frequencies and less supply, which will mean less employment in the sector, elimination of subsidiaries, especially those in the low-cost market, re-centralization of the parent companies, mergers of companies to create larger and stronger entities, which will greatly reduce competition and the war for low prices, and finally, a turn towards the Chinese market, especially for aircraft manufacturers. In this last point, above all, that may prove key to the future of Boeing and Airbus, the two main aircraft manufacturers, which have seen their orders fall and new aircraft cancellations multiply in recent months. It's Boeing and Airbus that are the next link in this chain of crisis in a faltering market. So, what does the future hold for the world's two leading aircraft manufacturers? Well, let's take a look.
Please buy my planes.
If there's one thing that Boeing would have wanted to avoid at all costs, it is precisely a global pandemic. Those of you who have been following VisualPolitik for some time now will know in detail what has happened to Boeing in recent years due to the disaster of its 737 MAX model, the defects in the 787, and the delay in the launch of the 777X, and the crisis that all this has generated for the company. Well, on top of that crisis, we must now add that of the SARS-CoV-2. A crisis that, given the uncertainty of its flagship model, translates into news like this.
Boeing suffers second consecutive month with no airline orders. The Associated Press.
Something that, by the way, had not happened since 1962. And as you can imagine, not selling anything for 2 months is a disaster for any company, let alone for one like Boeing, that was already seriously affected by damage done in 2019. Look, up to the third quarter of 2020, Boeing has lost more than $3.5 billion, while in 2019 it earned $444 million, which was already a long way from the $8.35 billion it earned in profits from the same time period in 2018. All of those losses accumulated in 2020. Nearly $3 billion occurred in the fateful second quarter, when the most severe period of the global confinement was being experienced. In addition, the difficult situation faced by airlines has resulted in cancellation of aircraft orders. Boeing, for example, already has a net loss of 1,020 orders and had only sold 67 aircraft up to the October 2020. What's more, it has only delivered 111 aircraft in that period, compared to the 321 last year for the same time frame. With these results, it is not surprising that Boeing is going to lay off more than 30,000 workers worldwide, which will mean getting rid of 18.7% of its entire workforce. Yes, it's true that in the medium and long term, everything will return back to normal. In fact, the recovery of the aviation sector in a year's time may see an increase in orders, because at the end of the day, planes need to be renewed sooner rather than later. But the picture in the short term is not so rosy. Airbus, on the other hand, things seem to be going a little better, and they will come out of the crisis in a slightly stronger position. Although, of course, this doesn't mean that it isn't affecting them. But having been the go-to manufacturer for airlines that wanted medium-range aircraft after the Boeing 737 MAX fiasco, has also given them some orders and deliveries. Thus, between January and October, Airbus has delivered 413 aircraft. Yes, 413 compared to 111 from Boeing. It's not bad, don't you think? But even so, that's 234 less than the number delivered between January and October 2019. And Airbus has also had to cut jobs. It has announced 15,000 layoffs worldwide, equating to 11% of its workforce. So you see, the aviation crisis is here, and everything points to it being here to stay, at least for a while. In any case, it is almost certain that the aircraft manufacturers will recover better than the airlines, particularly because there are countries like China where the demand for airplanes has not only not fallen, but continues to grow. The Asian giants will buy 8,600 new planes by 2039, worth about 1.4 trillion. Yes, that's with a T. If Boeing soon overcomes the effects of the grounding of the 737 MAXs, which it seems we will soon see flying again, and Airbus manages to save star programs like the A220, the near future for both manufacturers may not be so bad after all. But that is if you're looking particularly at Asia. However, in the airline industry, there is a long way to go. The big debts they are facing in order to maintain their fleets, jobs, and face fixed costs will drag them down for many years. If we also add to this the mergers and takeovers that undermine competition, which is unavoidable in the short and medium term, then things get even worse for the passengers. The only hope for airlines today is to fight back by raising prices and reducing costs. For example, by eliminating free passenger services and making travelers pay. All that, of course, if they manage to get some government help. But at this point, we want to hear from you. Do you think that the coronavirus will change the world of aviation forever, or will we go back to traveling as before? Could this pandemic push Airbus into the role of the world's leading aircraft manufacturer? Leave your answers in the comments. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.